For years, the Chinese government has allowed xenophobic sentiment to spread like wildfire in China. And now, we're seeing the deadly consequences. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The Chinese Communist Party has been flirting with xenophobia for years. And by flirting, I mean proposing quicker than a Love is Blind contestant. From the top of the Chinese Communist leadership, we have heard people like the ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, in 2022 describe the AUKUS security partnership between the US, the UK, and Australia as a race-based military bloc of white countries. Meanwhile, his colleague in the Foreign Service, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, said last year that China's East Asian neighbors, Japan and South Korea, should step away from the West and instead cooperate more with Beijing. To drive home his point, Wang added that no matter how blonde you dye your hair, how sharp you shape your nose, you can never become a European or American. You can never become a Westerner. Also in 2022, during a global resurgence in monkeypox cases, a senior Chinese health official advised people to avoid contact with foreigners to prevent infection as well as to maintain a healthy lifestyle. Because apparently monkeypox can only be contracted from non-Chinese people. This is just a scientific fact. Xenophobia in China is not just a feature of the government, however. Instead, xenophobia has become widespread on Chinese social media platforms. Observers have noted that you can find all kinds of racist sentiment on Chinese social media any given day of the week. Because even internationally, social media was a mistake. A report from last year by the non-governmental organization Human Rights Watch found that Chinese social media are littered with content containing anti-black racism. These often portray black people as impoverished and dependent, while also denigrating interracial relationships. After the outbreak of the Israel-Gaza war, there was also an explosion in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic content. For example, in comments posted online, an Israeli woman was described as a Nazi monster for having served in the Israeli military, and Jews were compared to vultures. Meanwhile, Palestine was described as a place that has no civilians, only little terrorists, old terrorists, female and male terrorists who should all be wiped out. There was even a call for the killing of Arabs to end terrorism. I can't tell if it makes China more or less racist that they seem to hate everyone equally. Yeah, definitely more racist. When confronted with the vast amounts of hate speech directed against foreigners on Chinese social media, former Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbing said last year that China's laws unequivocally prohibit disseminating information on extremism, ethnic hate, discrimination, and violence via the internet. But as the examples show, there is clearly a Grand Canyon-wide gap between China's laws and China's practice in this field. The fact that there is such a gap might seem quite strange given that Chinese online spaces are extremely restricted and heavily patrolled by, according to state media, more than 2 million censors at one point. The Chinese internet is so unfree that in the NGO Freedom House's Internet Freedom Report from last year, China received the lowest score of any other country, even lower than Cuba, Iran, and Myanmar. When they heard about this, the citizens of China said nothing, because there's no way they'd be allowed to see this on their internet. Just to give you a glimpse of the extent of the online control surrounding Chinese leader Xi Jinping alone, there are more than 35,000 sensitive words that are subject to censorship. And that was in 2020, so a lot more words have most likely come along since then. These words include Shisolini, Plague Lord Xi Jinping, and Diabetic Winnie the Pooh. You could fill a novel with words you can't say about old diabetic Winnie the Pooh. And I guarantee that book would be a much better read than Xi Jinping thought. In fact, the CCP is so oppressive about the online activity of Chinese people that even though a Chinese citizen compared Xi to Winnie the Pooh on X while in the US, he was still arrested and jailed upon his return to China. Because Xi hates being compared to Winnie the Pooh. Seriously, don't go to ChinaUncensored.tv/merchandise and buy this t-shirt. So the CCP clearly has the tools and the willpower to crack down on activities online, and could therefore do a lot to curb xenophobic content if they wished. But the fact that an army of censors often choose to leave hate speech targeting foreigners untouched shows that the CCP is willing to tolerate such content, or worse, it approves of it. And this has been especially clear when the focus is on Japan and the Japanese. We saw that last year when the Japanese authorities began releasing treated wastewater into the ocean from the Fukushima nuclear plant that was severely damaged by a tsunami in 2011. Even though Japan had gotten the green light from international experts at the UN, Beijing opposed the discharge, calling it an extremely selfish and irresponsible act. So to punish Tokyo, Beijing imposed a ban on all seafood going from Japan to China. The thing is, the Chinese authorities had previously released even more radioactive wastewater into the ocean than the treated water being released by the Japanese, which made the whole thing reek of hypocrisy and Chinese radioactive waste. But any attempt to expose this hypocrisy was swiftly censored and scrubbed from Chinese social media. Instead, Beijing fired back, saying that it was not spreading misinformation and accusing Tokyo of causing unpredictable harm to human and marine health. I guess China prefers their own brand of predictable harm to human and marine health. With the Chinese government only focused on portraying the Japanese as the bad guys in the situation, the stage was set for an explosion of anti-Japanese outrage. On Chinese social media, users posted videos of themselves calling Japanese businesses and institutions in the Fukushima area and shouting into the phone that they should stop the release of the wastewater. A number of real-world hate crimes were also reported, with one Japanese school in the eastern city of Suzhou having eggs thrown at it. Luckily, it didn't escalate to violence. That was unfortunately not the case in 2012, when an even more intense wave of anti-Japanese fever swept across China. Back then, anti-Japanese sentiment followed a flare-up of tensions over a territorial dispute regarding these islands that both Beijing and Tokyo claim. Anger over Japanese actions towards the islands sparked protests across urban China. Often, protests in China are quickly broken up by authorities, but this time, the authorities stood aside. As a result, the protests devolved into riots. In the central Chinese city of Xi'an, a Chinese man had to be rushed to the hospital after he was pulled out of his Japanese-made car and beaten within an inch of his life. They didn't even hate crime a Japanese person. They hate crimed a Chinese man for driving a Japanese car. When the authorities eventually stepped in to quell the unrest, Japanese stores, companies, and restaurants had been vandalized throughout China. The CCP's official news media, the People's Daily, subsequently wrote in an editorial that the protests were a symbol of the Chinese people's patriotism, which would be like calling domestic abuse a symbol of being a hopeless romantic. Chinese nationalism and xenophobia is particularly flammable when it comes to Japan because of Japan's brutal occupation of China during World War II. Events from the war have left a lasting imprint on the Chinese collective memory, according to Xiaoyu Yuan, a scholar of Chinese studies at Rutgers University. And it's a past that the CCP has been eager to exploit, probably because when you're actively ruining everyone's future, it's easier to just live in the past. Chinese state media often refer to Japan as a former aggressor and urge the country to reflect on its history and act prudently in fields related to military and security. While the CCP has been giving Tokyo advice on how to behave, anti-Japanese hate speech has escalated wildly on Chinese social media in recent years, far beyond occasional geopolitical disputes between China and Japan. For example, when a magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck Japan on New Year's Day, killing almost 300 people, a Chinese TV host asked his millions of followers whether the disaster was karma, which shows he lacks not only tact, but a basic understanding of seismology. What he meant was that Japanese were now getting payback for the atrocities their forefathers committed in China during World War II. A flood of similar xenophobic contents directed at Japan inundated Chinese social media platforms after the earthquake. One user with more than 170,000 followers declared that whenever an earthquake strikes Japan, any normal Chinese person ought to rejoice and gloat at their misfortune. Though I'd argue any normal human person ought to unfollow this count and realize that now and forever, social media is a mistake. The problem with leaving xenophobic sentiment to burn is that the fire can quickly get out of control. Modern history is rife with cases of political leaders that either tolerated or instigated xenophobia only for it to end in violence. For example, in 1969, ethnic Chinese were killed in multiracial Malaysia after a contentious election sparked xenophobic outrage among influential Malay nationalists who feared that the ethnic Malays were losing political influence in the country. And in Russia, violence against Central Asian migrants has seen a recent increase after public figures and state media began pushing ultra-nationalist sentiments directed at foreigners. A similar pattern now appears to be unfolding in China. On June 24th, a Japanese mother and her child were waiting for a bus used by a Japanese school in the eastern city of Suzhou, where they were viciously attacked by a Chinese man with a knife. The mother and her child likely only survived the attack because a Chinese bus attendant named Hu Youping intervened. Hu sustained injuries herself and died in the hospital 2 days later. The attack comes at a time when Chinese ultra-nationalists have targeted Japanese schools, suggesting that they are linked to spy training. The fact that people believe this shows they definitely don't work in the intelligence community. Combined with the overload of hateful rhetoric directed at Japanese that has saturated the Chinese media landscape, it's plausible to assume that the stabber was deliberately targeting Japanese people. The Japanese school that the bus was servicing was the same one that was egged last year during the wastewater outrage. Initially, as news of the Suzhou stabbing spread, the Chinese authorities once again cleared the way for xenophobic content to run wild. Censors removed posts attempting to debunk conspiracy theories about Japanese schools, as well as comments suggesting links between ultra-nationalist online content and offline attacks against foreigners in China. But as the stabbing attracted more and more attention, both domestically and internationally, the authorities finally changed track. About a week after the attack, Chinese tech firms announced that they would crack down on online hate speech. Around the same time, state media began praising the heroism of the bus attendant, who intervened in the stabbing. Her face was even projected onto the front of a super tall skyscraper in the northeastern city of Tianjin. Remember though, this is a week after the attack, when the story reached international audiences. The stabbing in Suzhou came less than 2 weeks after a stabbing of 4 American instructors from Iowa's Cornell College, which happened in a park in the northeastern city of Jilin. Coincidentally, Americans are nearly as often the focus of hateful content in China as the Japanese. Oh, did I say coincidentally? I meant predictably, because it's by design. An expert familiar with China's media landscape cited a rapid spread of both anti-Japanese and anti-American nationalism before the stabbings. The question now is whether the CCP will move censors away from patrolling things like the list of no-no names for Xi Jinping and instead focus on combating xenophobic content, or whether everyone will go back to slamming foreigners again once things have calmed down. Now, this is a very hard topic for me to cover on YouTube. A few years ago, I did a whole episode about the rise of anti-Semitism in China in this episode. YouTube demonetized and age-restricted it because it accused me of anti-Semitism. That's how bad things are. That's why China Uncensored has always relied on your support to continue. Join what I call the China Uncensored 50-cent army and support the show on patreon.com/China Uncensored. YouTube literally would have run China Uncensored out of business if it weren't for support from fans like you on Patreon. And as a thank you, I'll answer your questions or comments at the end of these episodes. Today's comes from Jay. I expect you're working on an episode about this already, whether here or on America Uncovered. But now that NATO have cleared a path for Ukraine and called out China's aid to Russia, it seems inevitable we're closer to direct war with Russia and its allies. How likely is China to side with Russia overtly if all of NATO went against Russia in a non-nuclear war? Would they perhaps soft aid them by using that as an opportunity to invade Taiwan? Seems unlikely China would ever join the CSTO pact for propaganda reasons, but something similar could arise. Great question, Jay. Yes, as I'm recording, a major NATO summit is just concluding, and I'll definitely be releasing a video about that, possibly on both channels. In case you didn't know, I also have a channel called America Uncovered where I talk about US news and politics. Check it out. So here's the thing, Jay. I think the Biden administration is doing everything it can to move the red line so they don't have to deal with China. Back in March 2022, Biden had a call with Xi Jinping. The president detailed what the implications and consequences would be if China provides material support to Russia. That's a pretty serious red line, and China has absolutely crossed it. So then, the US started talking about lethal aid to Russia, not material aid. If China gave lethal aid, that would be the red line. Well, this May, UK intelligence found evidence China was supplying lethal aid to Russia. And the US response was, no they aren't. So you can see that red line keeps moving because the US doesn't want to actually deliver consequences to China. And Xi Jinping knows it. That's why when Xi met Putin in 2023, he said, right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together. Clearly, Xi and Putin view the US as weak, and they will be the driver of changes for a new era. For more on the NATO summit, keep your eye out for an episode about that. Thanks for your question and your support, Jay. Join Jay on Patreon by clicking that orange button. And another way I'm trying to get around YouTube censorship is by hiding controversial topics in gaming content. Check out the latest episode of my new show, Deep Thoughts While Gaming, if a robot identifies as a woman. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.